Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. So hopefully everyone has Starry Night and ATM-4 up and running. I think what we'll do, just to kind of get back into the swing of things, is to just build a show up from scratch and kind of go through what we did yesterday. Throw a scene queue in and some time and maybe a toggle or two, and then go on from there. So let me get my screen up here for you all. All right. So hopefully you all have a new show. It looks something like this. So if you remember from yesterday, to add if you don't have a new show here, remember all you have to do is go up to File, New, and then that will create a new show for you, completely blank. And we have all our devices over here, and we're going to still be working in Starry Night. For now, we'll get into some other stuff a little bit later. And to add a cue anywhere on the Starry Night track here, remember all I have to do is double click, and the yellow time bar there will just jump right to where I clicked. Okay. So to start with, let's get a load a favorite. I want to load a favorite up onto the dome. And that is, what cue again is that? That is a scene queue. And go into favorites. And I have several favorites that I could pick from. What might be a good one to start and put at the very beginning of the show? You guys remember from yesterday when Scott was covering some stuff. He put a specific scene cue at the beginning of the show. Remember what that was? Black, yes, Paul. And the reason that he did that, and he explained it in depth yesterday, it's a really good way to just kind of just clear everything off of the dome. Whenever there's a cue at the very beginning of your show, your ATM-4 show here, when you load the show or when you rewind the show, it will send that command. And so what this will do is when you load this show, it will, no matter what you had going on with Starry Night up on the dome previously, maybe you're testing some things out, this will send the command so that it's all black up on the dome. You have no extra visuals there that you might not want. So this is a good way to kind of get a clean slate up on the dome for you. So after this, let's go ahead and put a scene cue that's going to show us something that we actually want to see. Okay. So I'm going to add another scene cue. And for this favorite, let's take a look at, we'll do sunrise. Okay. And let's say I want it to be a longer transition than 1 second. Everybody remember how to make a scene transition a little bit longer? A couple options. You could actually double click on that cue to bring it up and edit it. And I could change the transition time here. So maybe 3 seconds. Or with the mouse cursor, if I put it right on the edge of the cue here, I can click and drag just like that. Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm going to make a breakout room for Eric and Paul. All right, there you should be good to go, Eric. Okay. So now that we have a nice, transition into what this is going to be, let's test that out, see if we like it. Does everyone remember how to bring the playback controls back so that we can rewind and play our shows? If you don't have the black, so the favorites that are here, I made on my own. So if you don't have them yet, that's fine. The black favorite, you do have on your side home system. If you don't have it on your preview suite here, it's really easy to make. Just open up Starry Night Pre-Flight and turn all of your display options off. daylight, horizon, cardinal points, stars, and plan. Turn all of that off, and it'll be so that it's not showing anything, and then just save that as a favorite, and that'll get you a nice black favorite there. And then the sunrise one I just made yesterday. Scott was building part of the show. I hopped over to Starry Night, and I just set the sun close to sunrise and save that as a favorite myself. So you don't have to use these particular ones right now if you don't want to. But and yes, F4, David, is the correct thing to bring up the playback controls. It's also under View, Playback Controls. So I'm going to rewind, which gives me the nice black, clear image on the dome. And then about 4 seconds in, we get a nice transition, 3 seconds to sunrise there. All right. Now, what if I want a very long time before my sunrise scene comes up? I have the black up there. The audience is coming in. I just want some random amount of time before people come in. What could I do? What could I put into ATM-4 that would keep the show from advancing past where I want it to? Perhaps a pause? Yes, Scott, it is a pause. Scott was paying attention yesterday. So if you remember, pause is not pausing Starry Night, right? We went over that because the pause is, even if time is running in Starry Night, pausing ATM-4 is not going to pause Starry Night. So because it's affecting ATM-4 and the show itself, it's going to go up here on the control track, right? So up here, I have a pause, and I can put in the tagline here, whatever I want. So I'm going to say, start with a sunrise. And remember, anything that you type in here will display on your preview monitor, your pre-flight monitor, but it won't show up on the dome. So it can be very handy for notes. Okay, so we have our black scene. ATM-4 will be paused. As soon as we unpause here, we'll get a nice transition into sunrise. So just like yesterday, let's go ahead and move the sun across the sky a little bit. Okay, let's get into the daytime part. So that should be a time cue, hopefully, remember? So time cue right down there. And once again, the time here is giving you the controls that you have for the time rate controls in Starry Night. So running time, setting what you want the value to be, all those options there. So I don't think I saved a good option, a good rate of time into this favorite. So I'm going to say new rate. And I'm just going to say, I don't know, say 200 times. And if I'm not sure of the speed that I want here, is there a way I can test this out without having to run the show, stop it, change it, run the show, stop it, change it, and keep going through that pattern? Is there a quick way to just kind of preview what this will do? Execute. Yes. Fantastic. So if I hit execute here, what we see is the queue sends that command over to Starry Night. Now, if I don't like this and I change in my mind, I'm like, you know what? I don't want time to run. All I have to do is hit cancel, and notice that the queue didn't even get placed onto the timeline. So if you're working in that, you hit execute, you change your mind, like I don't want this at all, hit cancel, and it won't even place it on there. But I do really want this to happen, but I do want it to go maybe a little bit faster.
And Brad, just to be clear, I think if you just close the queue dialog without hitting OK, that accomplishes the same thing.
Correct.
Okay, I'm just making sure.
Yep. Yeah, the X and cancel are, they accomplish the same thing. Yep. Now, if you've already put the queue, so let's say I hit OK. Once the queue is already there, if I open it again, make some changes, and then decide that I don't like them, and hit cancel or the X here, it's not going to remove the queue, right? All it's going to do is just cancel your changes. So whatever the queue was like when you first created it, that's what it's going to be like when you open it again. So new rate, and let's just make this a little bit faster. Test it out. And that'll work. Okay. So let's say a little bit after, time runs for a little bit, say, I don't know, 5 seconds or so, and we want to take away the daylight so that we can see what stars are up right now. If the sun wasn't shining so brightly, we could see what's up there. What's it moving through? What's behind the sun right now? What kind of a cue would let us turn the daylight off?
Toggle.
Toggle, yes, thank you. Yeah, you can speak your answers. You don't have to use the chat window if you don't want to. So yes, so if I look at the toggle cue, which should be right up there. So again, the toggle cue, if you're trying to do something in ATM-4 that in Starry Night is just a toggle on or off in the display options, odds are you're going to find it in the toggle cue in ATM-4. And lo and behold, there's daylight, there's off, and I can test it out. And that's exactly what I want. Perfect. So I'm going to say OK. Now, what if I also want to get rid of that annoying horizon? What would I do? So I want the daylight off, which is great, but I also want to turn the horizon off. What command would that be?
Toggle.
Toggle again. Great. So I'm going to go back here to toggle. And I'm going to find horizon. And off is good. And I'm going to bring them close together here, really close. And this is probably going to accomplish what I want. They're going to turn off very quickly, or like one right after the other. But let's say I save this show, and then a couple months later I open it and I want to make some changes. I'm not going to remember exactly what's behind this toggle cue, am I? Right? It's on top of something. I have to move, and it's like, oh, there's another toggle, and I can open it up, and it'll say, oh, right, daylight. But if I want to be able to interact with these cues and make changes on the fly more easily than dragging it over here and going in and then dragging it back, what might I do? If I want to be able to have cues happen very soon after one after the other and be able to see them easily, what did we do yesterday? You guys remember?
Added a track.
We added a track. Yes, thank you, Scott. So basically, it's not, Starry Night doesn't care how many tracks ATM-4 has, but you might. So I'm going to go to File, Add Track, Starry Night. And again, the track name can be whatever you want. I'm going to call it what Scott did yesterday, Effects. And now to move a cue from one track to another, it's just cut and paste. So I'm going to use my Control X, the hotkeys, and I'm going to use the down arrow and Control V to paste. We could have gone here to edit, cut, and paste, and then selected the track, whatever is easiest for you. And now I can put this cue right here after the daylight there. So if I start my show right here and hit play, we're going to get that scene transition. I'm going to get time, and then a little bit after time, daylight and the horizon both turn off exactly like we wanted. Perfect. Okay. So let's try to anticipate the path that the sun will take across the sky, which happens to be called the ecliptic, right? So if I want to turn the ecliptic on the dome here, what cue would I use for that? Did this yesterday. Let's see if you remember. It's not a toggle. You might think it's a toggle, but the ecliptic here in this case is actually a dim cue. So remember, there aren't a lot of options under dim. but one of them happens to be the ecliptic. So I'm going to choose ecliptic here and set it to, I don't know, it'll be 80%. And execute. And now we see where the sun is on this particular date there. Now, if I wanted like the font to look different, or the color for the ecliptic to look different, I would go back to Starry Night, find this favorite, open it up, change those values, right? I could go into the ecliptic and make the font easier to read and maybe change the color and whatnot. And then I could save that favorite again, right? But I wouldn't want to save it with the ecliptic off, so that in ATM-4, when I turn it on, it looks exactly like I want it to look like. Right? This is what, we talked about this in Starry Night a little bit, and I know Scott has mentioned it in at least one session as well. So, when I was originally making my sunrise scene, if I knew I was going to be turning the ecliptic on at some point, then I probably would have gone in and at least made the font easier to read, because this, dim gray text is not the best for viewing on a dark sky. So if I was thinking ahead, that's what I would have done. Okay, so we have the ecliptic come up. At some point, I probably do want the stars to stop moving, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just throw another time cue in here. And there. And this one's just going to be a stop. And I'm going to go ahead and just execute that. It's not a good idea to make your audience too dizzy. A little bit's okay, but you want to not go too crazy. All right, so the last command that I think we got to yesterday and that we ended with was the list queue. All right, so we'll start with that now. Bring up the list. And if you recall from yesterday, the list queue in ATM-4 is your ability to turn individual objects on and off in Starry Night. So the top selection here is what type of object do you want? So if we want to do constellations, for example. And then the bottom one here is going to be the specific, in this case, constellation that I want to interact with. So if we say, I don't know, Major, turn it on, execute. Hey, look, there's Ursa Major. Okay. And so, like we looked at a little bit yesterday, there are a lot of different groups, a lot of categories you could choose from. So when you have some time, take a look and find kind of the different options that you have to work with there. So I turned Ursa Major on, which is great. It gave me the stick figure and the label there. Does anyone kind of remember why it might show me that? Or another way of asking that, what if I also want the illustration to come up for Ursa Major at the same time as the stick figure and the name? It's kind of a tricky one. I know we covered it in Starry Night, but that was a few sessions ago.
Can you save it as a favorite and then add a scene queue?
So how would we do that and saving it as a favorite? Let me bring my pre-flight window over here a little bit. So that's one way of doing it. We could resave the favorite, right? And so where is that in pre-flight? Someone just remind us?
Under display options.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be show stick figure, show illustration.
Exactly. So under constellations here, the indented ones, remember, apply to specific constellations, right? Excellent. Okay, so we could do that. We could open the favorite, check show illustration. In that way, when we get to that point in ATM-4, Starry Night will show the illustrations at the same time. There is a way to do that in ATM-4 instead of going back to Starry Night. Okay, so to do that in ATM-4, what kind of a command, what kind of a queue do you think this would be? It's probably going to be either a toggle or a list, right? And in this case, it is a toggle. So if I go to toggle here, you might have noticed this earlier. Yesterday, when we turned the constellations on, I used the option for all the constellation lines or illustrations, whatever I did. A little bit below that are individual constellations. And this is where you can change how specific constellations look. So if I say, hey, I want the individual constellation illustrations to turn on, and then execute, it's only going to apply to individual specific constellations that I have turned on. So if I have this toggle queue after the list here, what we should see is Ursa Major turns on, and it should look the way we saw it before with the stick figure in the name. And then a second after that, the illustration pops up. If I want the illustration to come on at the same time as the other two, I would just bring this toggle so that it happens before Ursa Major is turned on at all. And so what this will do is go to Starry Night, and it will turn on the option for illustrations, but we don't have any constellations turned on until we get to the list queue. Does that make sense? We'll run this through really quickly here. And I always like to start a show in the middle of a show right before a favorite, because a favorite is going to load all the settings. It's just kind of a useful thing to do. And now Ursa Major came on with the illustration at the same time, because that setting got turned on before we turned Ursa Major on. Make sense?
Brad, since you kind of showed that in combination with the auto-identify thing, would you do just one constellation illustration coming on all by itself, just so it's clear, why you would use this all constellation illustrations, all constellation, individual ones versus?
Oh, of course. So you want all the constellations up and then just the illustration?
Just do another individual one, like an individual stick figure, just so it's clear how you use that one. Okay.
You want me to remove these, or?
Yeah, it wouldn't hurt.
Okay. So let's say, so instead of Ursa Major coming up with a stick figure in the name, let's have some constellation come up and it's only the stick figure. Okay. So I don't want to go back to Starry Night and mess with the favorite. I just want ATM-4 to tell Starry Night to only turn on the stick figure for a specific constellation. Okay. So how do we do that? We would probably first have to change what the constellation will look like when it turns on, right? Because right now, if I turn it on, we'll get the stick figure in the name. So what we'll have to do first is to take a look into the toggle queue and make sure that for individual constellations, we don't want the labels on. And if I wasn't familiar with the favorite that I'm using and I wanted to be super safe, then what I might also do is throw another toggle queue here and make sure the boundaries are off. And put that right next to it. And then put another toggle queue and make sure that the illustrations are off. And then the final toggle queue will be to make sure that the lines are on, right? So what this is going to do, if I bring my pre-flight back over for a second, those 4 queues that we just made are the same as me going here in Starry Night and making sure that show boundary is off, show illustration is off, show name is off, and show stick figure is on. Those are going to set Starry Night to have exactly these values, right? Off, 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 on. And if I do that while we don't have any constellations selected, the audience isn't going to see a thing, right? This is all working in the background. So I could actually do this at any point. I could move this so it happened right after the scene if I wanted to, because we won't see this effect until we go to list, constellations, and we'll stick with the bears. turn Ursa Minor on. And so if we play through this, everything should be the same here. And when these toggles happen, we should see nothing showing on the dome, right? Because we don't have any constellations turned on yet. So nothing, nothing, nothing. And when Ursa Minor comes on, it's just the stick figure. Make sense? So this can be a really effective way of doing kind of a constellation quiz if you want, where you could have it set up so that the stick figure comes up and then you have a pause, give the students time to come up with the answer, and right after the unpause, you have the name come up, and then the name goes away, that constellation goes away, and move on to the next one. So, all right, just a couple more things we're going to do here. Looks like that time was right on top of another queue there, so I'm just going to move it off to the side. In a quick way, another quick way of executing a queue, if you right-click on a queue and just click on the top option there, that's the same as going into the queue and execute. So that can kind of save you a little time. Just right-click on it, select that top bolded option, and that will execute that queue for you. Let's take a look just briefly at what we call the star ball controls. So we touched on this briefly during Starry Night. In ATM-4, we have what's called the rate queue, somewhere around here, right there. And this is going to duplicate the star ball controls that you saw in Starry Night on pre-flight. So in this case, I just want to play with our latitude a little bit. And I can either have our latitude as positive if we want to move north, or negative if we want to move south. And I can stop it at a certain point if I want. So let's say stop at 80 degrees north. And so if I hit execute, what we should start to see is that the whole sky looks like it's moving south because we're moving north on the Earth, right? And then when this reaches 80 degrees north, we should see it stop. So that's the rate. And so you could also use this if you wanted to do, the other options. Heading, remember, that would just give everything a little bit of a spin. So, and look, we've stopped. So if you want to duplicate those star ball controls, there might be a few cases that you might want to do that. For example, Saturn can look really nice if you have Saturn in front of you and you just have a little bit of latitude motion. So you go from, say, below the rings to above the rings. That can look kind of neat on the dome. So there are a few cases where you might want to use the rate queue. Let's see, for Starry Night, just a couple that I'll mention briefly. I don't usually spend a lot of time on them. JMAG down here, magnify. This is if you want to artificially enlarge a planet or a moon. In Starry Night, remember, you had that magnification slider bar where you could slide that and the planet would get larger or smaller. So if I want to set the magnification of Mercury, I can do that. And Mercury, it's hard to see because it's the dark side. But you can see, just the sliver of the crescent there. This is the way that you could enlarge the planet. So you just use the magnify queue here. So I can enlarge it. And then a little bit after that, I would probably want to shrink it back down. Make sense? So maybe not one that you'll use a lot, but it is handy. And if the planet has moons attached to it, like Jupiter, the Galilean moons at least, you could select those instead of the planet itself. So this can be useful if you have kind of a generic sky talk of, hey, here's what's in the sky tonight. You could magnify them without having to go there. It can also be really neat to go there. Scott will be giving you tips and showing you how to do that a little bit later today. Another option is to zoom. If you want to just zoom in on the sky, if you want to just decrease the field of view, act like you're looking through a telescope, that's what the zoom feature is here. So if I want to zoom to, say, I don't know, 90 degrees, I'll just keep it as the default here for now. I've now zoomed in the sky, so I'm only seeing a part of the sky here. I'm going to zoom back out. I can do that as well. So if in your favorite you've like centered on an object, like maybe you have Jupiter right, you've centered on Jupiter. What this would do is actually zoom in on Jupiter, on that object that you've centered on. So that can be a handy cue as well. I think those are all the cues that I typically cover for Starry Night. Does anyone have questions on these? I know Scott has something in Starry Night he wants to go over. And then after that, we'll take a look at putting audio into an ATM-4 show. But does anyone have any questions on toggle, list, rate, time, any of these Starry Night cues that we've done so far? Is everyone able to hopefully at least follow along a little bit and get some stuff working?
Hey, Brad, just real quick, could you just copy the cue again?
Yep.
Because it's the only thing I'm just trying to refresh myself here.
Yep.
Thanks.
No, that's fine. Yeah. So let's say this line, up here is getting a little bit too cluttered. I'm going to use one of these, zoom. Maybe I want to put down here. Just make sure that you have the right cue highlighted. So it'll be a little bit lighter gray there. Also, you could click and drag a box. So if you want, like, maybe I want both of these cues to move, I could drag a box so that both of them are selected. And now if I cut, either Control X or Edit Cut, go down to the track that I want and make sure that the yellow time bar is where I want them to go. And now I paste them down and they get pasted down just like that. And if they're not exactly where I want to go, I can, again, highlight both of them and move them as a group, and the spacing will remain the same. So that's also something useful. Yeah, Taylor.
I have a question about the tracks. So I see you have an effects track. That's not showing up on my ATM-4.
Yep.
And is that something that you have to add, or?
It is, yeah. So by default, ATM-4 just gives you one track for every device that you have over here. So to add a new one, all you have to do is go to File, Add Track, and in this case, I wanted more space for Starry Night. So I just said Starry Night, and then give it whatever name you want.
And so if you wanted, you could put all of those cues that you did on one track? Or...
You could. What you'll probably find is if you have a lot of things happening at the same time or very close to it, it will get very busy. It's also very useful for organizational purposes to have, all your scenes on one and maybe, some others on other tracks. And when we get to putting images and movie clips up on the dome through Starry Night, you definitely want one track per image for both you and ATM-4.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, I'm going to stop my share. And Scott, if you want to go over any Starry Night cues that you want to, go ahead.
I do. I want to cover something that's a little bit more challenging. It gets a little deeper into Starry Night and ATM-4 functionality, but it's so important that I don't want to gloss over it. Is everybody seeing my screen now? I have one of Dave Bradstreet's curriculum mini lessons open. This one's called Planet Definition, and it explains why Pluto is classified as a non-planet. And one of the things that you'll notice is that at the beginning, very near the beginning of his show, is a little cue that says INT. And what that stands for, that's short for focus of interest. And you'll notice near the end of his script is a little cue called PFNS. And you'll hear some of our operators jokingly referring to that as a puffness. PFNS is what Kelly will call a puffness cue. So if you ever hear us use that term, we're referring to this preferences cue here. These relate to Starry Night's preferences, and there are two kinds of preferences that are very important to understand when you're making and editing ATM-4 shows. The first is your focus of interest, and I may be reviewing something that Brad has already covered, but I want to return to focus of interest for just a minute in preferences. If you look at my render box, actually, this will make a great deal more sense if I take a little trip to another planet. I'm going to send us to Mars for a moment. And you'll notice if you're looking at Mars on my preview screen here, there's only a certain height that I can move Mars up to. If I grab my whole sky and drag it up, you'll notice that Mars is only about a quarter of the way up my preview window. And that's because our focus of interest preference has been set to near the edge of the dome. As a reminder of how you do that, if I go into my file menu and I go to render box preferences, you'll notice a little slider here for focus of interest. And focus of interest, again, is when objects sort of fly in toward you or fly away from you, how high on the dome will they be? If the focus of interest is set all the way to the dome zenith, let's say we start flying toward Mars or another planet, we'll see it at the very top of the dome, at the zenith of the dome. It'll be very high. But that means the audience is looking straight up above their heads to see objects flying in and out. So what we often do is we set that focus of interest to closer to the dome edge so that the audience, as things are, flying away from us, flying toward us, that interest area is lower and it's easier for them to see, okay? Now I'm gonna go back into Dave Bradstreet's script here. What he's done is he's told the focus of interest to be way up to the zenith. The reason Dave Bradstreet does that is because he's got a concentric theater. Everybody sits around the edge of the theater looking in. And that means if you had the focus of interest really low and you were sitting on the front of the theater, the thing would be really low behind you, right? It would be extremely low on the dome. So Dave likes everything to be up at the zenith so everybody gets the same view. So what he does for his show specifically is he sets the focus of interest to be all the way at the zenith of the dome. Here's the problem with the focus of interest is if I play my show, let's say I just play Dave's show, and the whole thing runs, and I get to the end of the show here, and I don't bother to run the end of the show. If I stop, or let's say I just grabbed a little bit of Dave's show and I accidentally grabbed this interest cue, this is going to reset your system so that from now on, everything's going to be up at the zenith. It's going to reset your focus of interest. So what Dave does and what you'll want to do is at the end of any show, when you're done with this program, if there was a focus of interest change, if something changed that preference, you'll want to have what we call a puffness or a PFNS cue at the end. So the way you can think of it is anytime you see one of these INT cues, that's going to mess up your preferences. Whenever you see one of these PFNS cues, that's going to fix your preferences, okay? The same is true for orientation animations. Dave has an orientation animation here, and what we'll do sometimes is when orientations are flying around in space and moving things in space, that might be set to really, really slow. Like Dave might have wanted to fly up to a planet extremely slow. If somebody does an orientation animation in their show, or you do an orientation animation, it's going to reset how fast you fly through space preferences. And going forward, after you do an OA, all of those preferences are going to change. So let's say you like to fly up to planets pretty quickly normally. As soon as you do a slow orientation animation, or there's a show with a slow orientation animation or a super fast orientation animation, that will overwrite your preferences and it'll mess things up. So a thing to remember there is that an INT or an OA, if it's an INT or an OA, it's going to overwrite your preferences unless there's this thing here that resets your preferences back to the way you like them. So the job of this PFNS is basically all it does is say, I know your preferences got messed up earlier in the show with an OA or an INT. This is going to restore those preferences. But in order for that to work, you guys have to do one thing. You have to sort of tell ATM-4 what your preferences are. So very quickly, without going into a ton of preferences here, here's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the two preferences that matter. So we're going to go into our File menu, Render Box Preferences. And we're going to set our focus of interest to wherever we like them. For most theaters, you want your focus of interest down here somewhere, because that's going to give you this. That's going to give you things flying in and out, kind of lower on the dome so they look comfortable for the audience. If you want, you could have them way up near the zenith. You could be flying in and out of places and they come from way up on the zenith. But let's say you like your focus of interest to be there. And just to make sure, does anyone have any questions about what I mean by focus of interest? Is that fairly clear? I don't want to over explain, but I just want to make sure I'm not confusing you. Basically, focus of interest is that little guy who flies in and out is kind of down near the edge of the dome or up high on the dome, okay? So once you get that to where you like it, another one that's important, and this one is very important, is responsiveness. Let's take elevation step for a second. I'm going to set my elevation step in my render box preferences to really slow, like 1, okay? And then I'm going to fly away from Mars. Okay, so in pre-flight, I flew away really quickly. But look at what's going on in render box. Mars is flying away from us so slowly, we can barely see it. Take my word for it, we're flying away from Mars, but it's going so slow, we can't even detect it. But I might have done an orientation animation in a ATM-4 show. I might have done this orientation animation where elevation flying around happened really, really slowly. And if I do that, and that happens in a show, later on, you're always forever going to be flying around really slowly unless you fix it, okay? So here's what I suggest everybody do. Go into your render box preferences and play around with the responsiveness. I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong, but set your responsiveness. How fast do we fly around from object to object? How fast do we zoom in? How fast do we center things? How fast do all these things happen? Generally, a safe area is about 1/4 of the way up on all of these. Just a good place to start, but play around with them. And then as you do things like zooms and flying around in space, look at your render box and determine if that's the right speed. It's entirely up to you. I'm not saying they're correct or incorrect settings, but get everything set in your preferences, in your responsiveness and your focus of interest the way you like them. And then after you've done that, if you really are happy with your responsiveness preferences and your focus of interest preference, you're going to go into ATM-4. And this is the important thing. In ATM-4, you're going to go to the console menu. And way down at the bottom of the list, you're going to see Save Current Starry Night Preferences. And if you click on Save Current Starry Night Preferences, here's what happens. Whenever there's a PFNS queue, it's going to restore it back to the way you set it. So if you like your focus of interest down low on the dome, as soon as this PFNX is executed, it's always going to set Starry Night back to the way you like it. Okay? So if you see a focus of interest in somebody's show, make sure that the show always has a PFNS in it. And it's the most important thing, make sure you run the show so that the PFNX gets executed, right? If you're in a Bradstreet show, you want to make sure that that PFNS thing happens, all right? So set your preferences in Starry Night the way you like them, interest and responsiveness. Once you're really sure you have them the way you like it, capture them forever by going into Console, Save Current Starry Night Preferences, and then make sure if you do anything like an interest or an OA that's going to mess up the preferences, that somewhere at the end of the show, you get one of these PFNS queues so that it resets things back to the way you like them. Any questions on that? I know that's a lot of detail, but it's important that you remember to do that. And you just have to do it once. Just set them, go into Console, save your preferences, save Current Starry Night Preferences, and then this PFNS is your friend. It's always going to set you back to the way you like to be. All right. Oh, Brad, I'll give you your screen back.
Okay. In the last couple of minutes here, I just want to show you how to quickly drop a music file into your show. So if you want some background music or you have narration, anything like that, it's really not complicated. Let's see. Everyone seeing everything? Yep, good. So you have a couple of different options. For today, I'm going to be using Soundtrack. There's another device that we call Spitz Audio, which is typically what I recommend. You might have it on ATM-4. My version of ATM-4 is just not working at the moment. But on your actual pre-flight and render box, that's the track that you really want to use for audio. Main reason being that the Soundtrack has a lot of limitations that the Spitz Audio, let's say pre-flight audio or render box audio, those don't have the same limitations. For example, Soundtrack, you can only have one file playing at a time. You don't have individual control of volume, things like that. So the layout is very, very similar, which is why it's okay to show it to you this way. But just keep in mind that you might have the option. You definitely have the option in your planetarium for using the pre-flight audio or render box audio, and that's the way I recommend it for long term. But for now, we're going to go here, and it's pretty simple. You load. All you have to do is load the audio file and play the audio file. So if I go to load, it's going to ask me what file. I'm going to use from the Fulham curriculum, the Perry Mason theme song here. And I'm going to I'm going to load it wherever I want, because loading it isn't going to be the same as saving it, or as playing it, sorry. And so when the scene starts here, that is when I want it to start playing. So I'm going to say hit play. And okay, you notice that the track after it kind of divided. There's 3 lines that are kind of there. That's ATM-4's way of telling you, hey, there's something going on. In this case, there's an audio file playing. If you're controlling your cove lights, the same thing. If they're on, you'll see this. It's ATM-4's way of telling you that you have something going on here. So I'm going to share my computer sound. Let's see if we can actually hear this going on here. So this has loaded it. Now I have background music playing. So I'm going to stop that. Stopping is when it comes to the music, the audio, stopping does stop the playback of your audio files. So just something to be aware of there. And that's the basics of putting audio into your ATM-4 show. The one difference, if you have your pre-flight audio track, that device working, is that in addition to load and play, we could also seek forward if we really wanted to. So if I put a seek cue in there, I could jump forward to a different part of the file. So I can jump in like 30 seconds. The one additional feature you'll have is you'll have the volume control. So, which is another benefit in its favor. So you can have the music playing. So let's say you have background music and then narration and maybe sound effects. You have the background music playing, that fades down when you have a narration track start, so that you can hear the people talk. And when they're done talking, you can have the background music ramp back up. It can be very handy. But one last time here. So this should seek 30 seconds into the sound. Now we're in a very different part of the song. So the basic way of just loading audio into your show is load and then play whenever you want it to play. And if I wanted to stop, if I don't want it to play all the way through, I would just put a stop somewhere at the end and it would stop. So not too complicated, but I did want to make sure that we covered this because it is a very, very useful feature. So we are out of time here. Any last minute questions before we do a short break? Where's my chat?
Hey, I just want to mention one thing before we stop. I think you guys will notice, if you were paying attention to the schedule before, we had a different schedule in mind for 4 o'clock this afternoon. We've changed one of the sessions to be an introduction to navigation, which is actually going to cover a lot of cool things like how you position things in space, how they move in really interesting ways, how you can do some neat special effects to get like planets to turn in ways that you can't do in obvious ways. And we intended that to be kind of the introductory track. So my suggestion would be if you've been doing the kind of introduction to Starry Night and introduction to ATM-4, this track 1, what we call, what is it called, Brad? Navigation or?
Introduction to navigation.
Navigation or yeah. I would recommend doing the track 1 at 4 o'clock too, because we'll get through a lot of introductory stuff about animations and moving things around that we haven't gotten to yet.
3 o'clock Eastern.
Oh, is it 3 o'clock? Sorry.
Yep.
Right, that's coming up, isn't it?
Yep, that's coming up.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone, and we'll see you later.